I don't know what was going on with this. I mean, my computer was just slow this morning anyway, so something was clearly running.
Hmm.
This happened to me once where I was supposed to get on a call that was a little bit important, and of course, my entire computer decides to update every piece of
Yes.
software, and then the internet shuts down, and I'm like sitting here going like,
Yeah.
this job might hinge on this call. For our listeners at home, we have Michael Cassutt here on the program, who is a writer and a TV producer, among other things. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
No, I'm happy to be here. It's always happy to meet Max Headroom fans and writing fans in general. So, yeah, what do you need to know?
Mm,
How can I disabuse you of fantasies and illusions?
Well, the first question that we had for you, because Austin and I are both radio people, is we saw in some of our Googling around online that your first job after college was working in radio. And what we'd like to know is what kind of show did you do?
Yeah, I was almost almost done with college in Tucson, Arizona, and they had a very enlightened policy at the University of Arizona in the 70s where the PBS station on the campus, the writer, producer, directors were faculty members, which made sense, and a couple of just professional engineers, but the crew was students. So we were working on all kinds of fantastic things. I was the camera operator for a 6-hour live telecast on national PBS, things like that. So I had all this kind of broadcasting experience in that sense, and I had done a lot of audio for live things, city council meetings, and so I was able to move into a fellow graduate had been doing some part-time work at a station. He was leaving, and he knew I was interested, and just said, "Hey, would you be interested in this?" And so yeah, I went over, interviewed, and got the job. It was a low-power daytime station, and I stayed there for 3 years. I had a real good time. I made absolutely no money. I was horrifically low paid, but I got to do everything. After about a year, they made me the program director and operations manager. So I was playing rock and roll and dealing with personalities. All of them were older than me. Some of them very quirky, but did that for like 3 years and had a great time. My legacy is that I probably have some hearing loss in a couple of frequencies, thanks to just sitting there with headphones playing the hits of the 70s, very loud.
Right. Yeah, we benefited
So yeah,
in our era of
radio.
going. We got to get free concert tickets from time to time. Was that ever a part of your gravy train?
Oh yeah, I saw everybody who came through Tucson in those days. I mean, um, for example, and being in radio, you kind of had at least a certain amount of cachet or entree. So I remember going to a party that Linda Ronstadt had. She was Tucson native, so when she came back
Right.
for a big concert, it was a big deal. And I remember talking to her boyfriend at the time, who was Albert Brooks, the comedian, just standing there watching Linda, who did not actually engage very much with the people at the party, other than her family members, but she was singing old mariachi songs with the mariachi band, and
Wow.
basically singing to them. And I'm standing there talking to Albert Brooks, whom I knew as a stand-up and a comedian from television, basically. So, how are you, Mr. Brooks? That kind of thing. So those things were a ton of fun. I mean, it would be everything from Lionel Richie to Olivia Newton-John to, well, Elton John, 1975, things like that. So yeah, it was a ton of fun.
That's so cool.
That's
Just had no
really
money,
cool.
then no future, but
That's a lot of the rock and
it
roll
helped me
story.
make the transition from, I've just gotten out of school, I have a car. Yeah, yeah. It made the transition from getting out of school, not having anything, to 3 years down the line having some experience.
I was reading around that I think you had your first story published when you were 20 in an amazing science fiction magazine, if I'm not mistaken. Was this something that you had been wanting to do growing up? You were like, I want to try to get some short fiction published, or how did you kind of fall into I mean, a lot of young writers do this where they start getting short fiction published as a bridge to the next part of their career.
I never thought of fiction writing as like a bridge to another career. I always thought that was a pretty cool career.
Okay.
But even at a young age, say 18, I was pretty hip to the idea that it wasn't necessarily a way to make a living. I mean, I was fairly canny about publishing even then, and I'd read a lot. And for someone who grew up in basically a small town in Wisconsin, you had access to things. I said, no, chances of me making, say, even writing science fiction or anything was going to require a lot of work. I'd always wanted to write, but I was happy to write journalism. I was happy to be a broadcaster, which to me seemed to be accessing the same part of my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately to write television. So those were the sort of like the three fronts, but they were all to me the same thing. It was just being part of writing and producing. And I had wanted to start writing even when I was in high school, and started submitting stories to these science fiction magazines, some of which are still around and still perfectly capable of publishing stories by people who are 17 or 18 if they want to. Got my first rejections, and then wrote a story in my first semester at school, a short story that I sent off and heard nothing about for about a year and a half, and then read in a sort of a fan magazine about the science fiction world that here are the stories scheduled for publication this summer and amazing stories. And oh, there was mine. And literally about 2 days later, I got notification from the publisher and got like some $20 check or something, but which is a confirmation again that this was really not a way to make a living. So on the other hand, I was also doing a little, even when I was in radio, I did a little work for my former PBS station, and they were just as bad. I mean, I was literally writing some variety show, one of those kind of evening talk shows, and the pay was a pittance, and it was late all the time. So
this is one of those things where, as somebody who's tried my hand at being an amateur musician and done a little bit of writing here and there, it's relieving to hear that my experience is reflected in people who do it professionally.
My experience is that everybody, no matter what their level of ultimate success or getting beyond getting paid a pittance and very late, is that everybody went through it. Everybody I know has gone through some horrible Darwinian experience that either drives you out of it or you just somehow get through it. There is, I mean, you look at someone like me who's actually made it work for 40 years. Think, oh yes, it does work. I am well aware. It's like Omaha Beach. This is like the opening of Band of Brothers. Most people don't get through it.
Right.
And I have great sympathy and affection for, people who were trying the same things I was doing at the same time and just decided to wave off or got swept away or whatever. I also have friends who are contemporaries who are far more successful. So there is that.
Yeah. Another experience I think we all relate to.
On the topic of writing, we know that
Yes.
because we've been looking for the key to how to write, and we know the answer is write. But what we were wondering about was, what's your specific process or some elements of it?
I think my process has always been just fairly straightforward and very common. I'm as a writer, I'm a huge believer in regular hours. You treat it, it's not a business, but you do have to have business-like aspects to it. I mean, right now and for 25 years, my writing process, my schedule has been 5 days a week, start at 9 in the morning, write a certain amount till about 11:30, take a 2-hour break, come back and work in the afternoon from 2:30 to 4:30. On that schedule, I will, if I'm writing fiction, I will write 4 pages at minimum a day. If I'm writing a script, probably 5. I've been known to divide my work day and work on fiction one part of the day and nonfiction another part of the day. And this is just something I evolved. I mean, I have friends who they only write at midnight or something like that, and
So romantic.
God bless them. I mean, I'm sure it works. I'm not a big believer in trying to, although I have had the wonderful experience of having some, like a short story, just appear in my head. The most successful short story I ever did, I got a book one night, or I'd gotten a book as a present. I was flipping through it and saw a picture one night. I thought, oh, that's an interesting thing. And it was a paragraph of text. Next morning in the shower, I decided, oh, there's a short story in that. I went to my day job, which was CBS at the time, just kind of thought about it a little bit. Because by then I'd probably written 15 or 20 short stories. It wasn't an unusual process. Came home that night, sat down at 7, and by 9:30, I had written this 10-page story that I sold immediately. And has been reprinted like 7 or 8 times.
Nice.
Wow.
Clearly my most successful story. It was sort of like it was just there and just circling in the universe and landed on me. On the other hand, I've worked on stories that have taken. I mean, I have a story in my files that is about to be done that I can find its origins in some notes I made in some first few paragraphs I wrote on teletype paper at a radio station in Tucson, Arizona in 1978. And by God, this story is almost ready to go. It's gotten long. It's taken a lot of twists and turns, but it's still that story from 40 to 43 years ago. So that kind of covers the spectrum, I think.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's just fascinating. Thank you.
And that's also inspiring for people who save everything as well and think that, like, oh yeah, someday I want to do something with that thing that I worked on 20 years ago. Like it's good to know that these things do have lives of their own that can come back to.
Yes, I mean there is a danger, and it's interesting that you raise that, because what my hobby has been the beginning of this year is purging my old files.
Nice.
And and I can tell you, any set of credits you've ever seen from me only represents a third or a quarter of the stuff I've written. And especially in television, I have a huge number of busted projects. I mean, things that I was developing. I mean, that's true of anybody in television and film. And I decided that they're just taking up space. I have all these old scripts from 1983 or 1992 that are, nobody uses brads to bind things anymore. It's been an Adobe PDF for 20 years. Rusted paper clips, and they're just paper. And so what I've done is I've been going through and purging the files. In essence, scanning. Like I like 4 drafts of some script I wrote for some producer in 1994. First of all, I still have some scripter files that will work, because I have the older Movie Magic and the newer Movie Magic script software that will convert. And if I ever want to reconstruct it in all the other drafts. But I also have been asking myself why. So I kind of take my preferred draft and scan that and keep the electronic files, and I've gotten rid of all this paper. And I was telling a friend of mine, a longtime friend of mine, this, and this will be name drop number 1. That friend's name is George R.R. Martin. He was horrified. He was raging at me. What's wrong with you? Why can't you just give all those old scripts and stories and things to a university? And I just laughed. I said, what university, George? I mean, they want yours. They don't want mine. And by the way, I have the significant material, just in electronic form. Just, well, yes, the cloud could die, and there you are. I said, I've got it in, there's a keychain. It's like on a laptop, a keychain, and in the cloud. I figure one of those is likely to survive. And if the world gets to the point where they don't survive, my archive is not of importance, because it means an asteroid has hit us, or I don't know, Trump came back and became president number 47. I don't know, whatever sort of
Please don't write that
ridiculous
story.
um, scenario would play out.
Yeah.
Um, so yes, but what I still have been doing is keeping the story notions,
Yeah.
because who knows when I want to go back. But part of the mindset is also, especially with the scripts and some of these great concepts and pilots and specs I wrote, it's like I'm done with them. I'm not going back to these TV things to say,
Right.
oh no, in this world, no, I'm just not. It's like I'm looking forward, not looking back.
Right.
But that's just me because I just burned myself out on that.
Mm. Well, since you mentioned George Martin, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you guys worked on Twilight Zone together. Is that how you guys met?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Actually, no, we had met through the science fiction field, going to
That makes
conventions.
sense. That makes sense.
Because after my first story, I'd gone on and sold some other stories. I had a novel in progress, and I would go to the occasional, like the Science Fiction Writers of America Nebula Awards thing every spring. I mean, he knew who I was. I knew who he was, and we had probably exchanged a few words. I was a fan of his short work. He was winning all kinds of awards.
Right.
But I didn't know him particularly well, but I did know him. But I walked into Twilight Zone one day early in 1986, having written a couple of freelance episodes. I think I was coming in to pitch for the new year or coming in to drop something off. And there he was sitting literally on the couch in the office. He had also done some freelance that first year and had just been hired as the staff writer, which is the lowest of the low on the show. And I was freelancing. Oh no, I'm sorry. Actually, it's probably a little earlier than that because he was the staff writer in the first year when I was freelancing. And then when they renewed it for a second season in spring, like May 1986, George was promoted to story editor, and I was hired to replace him. So the two lowest level writers on Twilight Zone in 1985-86 were me and George R. R. Martin. And we had some various adventures. And then George and I also were kind of swept along to Max Headroom when Twilight Zone was ending. George didn't get anything produced that year or ever. And by the time, Max had its renewal after its spring 87.
Right.
George was busy on Beauty and the Beast. So he did a freelance episode for it. But he lived in LA and lived near me certainly from 1985 to probably well into the 90s. He was probably half here and half in Santa Fe.
That makes sense.
So we became buddies then and hung out a lot. So
now, I mean, this is probably the case.
George on Twilight Zone, staff writer.
This is probably the case for you as well. But I know Heather and I have talked about this on the show, where Twilight Zone was something for us growing up. That the original Rod Serling was like very influential, and so when the 80s one came around, I was like locked in. I was like, yes, this is for me. Did you grow up with that same experience of having watched a Twilight Zone and now you're making it?
Oh my God, yes, it was absolutely that, because Twilight Zone, I mean, it was, I'm older than you guys, so to me I was seeing it new. Although it was actually even slightly, I mean, it was off the air by the time I was 10, I think, but it was the creepy, scary show, that and Outer Limits.
Sure.
I wound up working on both of them.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, the idea was, oh my God, there's Twilight Zone and I have to be part of this. And by the time it was being revived, I was still working at CBS, but I had already sold a couple of comedy scripts. So I was at least somewhat experienced, and I published a lot of short stories, and I knew a few people like George and Alan Brennert in the world. So I was determined to be part of the new one, and got in, I think, as one of the early people to pitch freelance episodes. And because it was an anthology, they would, that's what they were doing. And it was great.
Right.
I'm not sure we consistently honored the, Twilight Zone, at least the Twilight Zone that I grew up with and understood. We did a few things that I thought were wildly inconsistent with that. But then again, it was the mid 80s, not 1960. And there were some great writers and great stories that we did. So it was fun. I mean, they've revived it like 3 or 4 times since.
Right.
Always seeming to forget the core reason or the core nature of a Twilight Zone series. And I should cite an exception here. I think The third iteration, a syndicated one that followed directly on the CBS. And Michael Straczynski, Joe Straczynski, was the producer, story editor, story honcho for that. He had a pretty good understanding of what a classic Serling story was. I mean, I think there are flaws with his version as well, but at least, because to me, a Twilight Zone story is a 2-act story. So when you have a 1-hour Twilight Zone, you're not doing a Twilight Zone.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
The other part of a Twilight Zone that makes it work is the narration. The narration saves you, and I proved this to myself, saves you 2 scenes of exposition. That ironic, something strange happens to an ordinary person story. That to me is a Twilight Zone story. There are other perfectly acceptable ways to tell science fiction, fantasy, horror stories in a dramatic form. But they're not necessarily Twilight Zones, or they're just something else. Outer Limits was a completely different form,
Right.
I thought. Didn't do me any good knowing that, but I still stick to it. So yeah, it was a ton of fun just to know what was coming back and to be associated with it, and then to see it from the inside and see it. I was literally the last. It was like, I don't know, DiCaprio in the Titanic. I was the last person off Twilight Zone, as it was. It's like a body that was dying because we had been canceled, but we still had a few things to deliver.
Right.
And so we were spread over something like 5 buildings at CBS Radford, which is still around the corner from me. And about every week they would come by and close out one set of offices, and then who's ever left would have to move. Some people were gone. And it basically became like George and me, were the only 2 writers left in one building out of 5. And even then George left because his deal was up before mine. So I was the last person there, simply around, like, if somebody would come up, we're doing post-production, we need wild lines, we need somebody to look at this cut because we need to have some walla that is written to be recorded and put in here. That was my job. I kind of turned out the lights when I left.
Oh.
Wow.
Oh. I mean,
But then I went right into Max. I mean, I didn't go right into Max Headroom,
Mhm.
but Max Headroom was my next port of call about 4 months later, 3 or 4 months later.
You
But I
hear
was already writing one by then.
you hear stories about shows ending, but very rarely do you talk to the very last person that was on the show.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, I could feel the cold, icy water right up to here. It was sad. And infuriating because it really didn't need to go that way. I think had things been a little different, the show could have had a good run,
Right.
even though I know objectively as a viewer, and even from a more informed subjective view as a former network executive and historian of television, that an anthology show is just it's almost no chance of working in the broadcast universe as it existed then or really now.
Yeah.
It just, Twilight Zone was considered to be an anomaly even in 1960. In fact, when Serling sold the show in 58, CBS didn't want it. I mean, they had to buy it because he had a deal. They were going to buy whatever he wanted to do, and he wanted to do a half-hour science fiction fantasy anthology. And I have it on good authority that the reaction from CBS was, "Oh God, not that, not an anthology."
Some of them still react.
That's the same way. Here's a little bit of television history. The same way, The Fugitive got on the air in the early '60s. It was not. Everybody looks at it. It was a huge success. It's still one of the most viewed hours of TV drama ever. 50 million people watched the finale. ABC did not want that concept. Roy Huggins, the television genius who was pitching it, did not actually want to be in there. He was sort of in there because his agent had made a deal for him, and told him they have to take basically whatever you want to do. And he was pitching it to a room full of ABC executives, and every one of them said, "This is the dumbest idea I've ever heard. We don't want to do this." And it was only because he had a deal, and the actual president of ABC at the time was sitting at the end of the table, said, "I kind of like this." And the kind of thing you never think would happen. especially if you're Max Headroom fans. You know, think of that boardroom in Max Headroom and the toadies around it with Ben Cheviot.
Right.
It's like Ben Cheviot saying he likes it, and somebody who's his deputy, the West Coast deputy, is actually saying, no, it's a dumb idea, sir. I mean, this apparently the head of ABC out here still said, no, we don't want to do this. We don't want to do this. And he just, well, we're going to do it. We did it. And so that happened. And in fact, almost every breakthrough piece of television you could think of has only gotten on the air because somebody pushed, or there was an accident, like Hill Street Blues going on NBC at a time when their ratings, they were the 5th out of 3 networks. Right. You know, so they had to put something on. So that was Twilight Zone, and that was its history, and that's why, you know, it keeps coming back, and it's never actually a smart move. I would not do it. So how about that? You know, I was happy to be part of it, but I still wouldn't do it myself.
Sure.
Not if I wanted to make money and be a success as any kind of network or channel.
So if we have this story right, you were working on the Twilight Zone right before you were working on Max. And in Austin's research, what he found was that you were one of the few writers anyone met with who got what Max was about right away. Is that how it went? Like, do we have the story right?
Well, it's certainly flattering to me, and I know that Steve Roberts thinks that, and I think the evidence suggests. I mean, what happened was that Phil DeGuerre, who was the showrunner for Twilight Zone, fantastically funny, occasionally troubled, very experienced TV producer, as Twilight Zone had been canceled and we were still, you know, tie off the wounds. He got partnered up with the team that was at ABC that was going to do Max Headroom, that he was basically brought in to babysit Peter Wagg, the British producer. And so Phil, looking around, saying, well, here's this 6-episode order for this very cutting edge science fiction dystopian TV series. And here I've got all these writers on Twilight Zone who are the best writers of this kind of stuff I know. So all of us were given a chance to pitch to Max Headroom. A couple of people, I don't think Alan Brennert wanted to, or I think he was off doing something else, and Rockne O'Bannon had just sold a feature film, which became Alien Nation, so he was going off to do that. But there was a guy named Jim Crocker, another writing team, Marty Pasco and Becky Parr and George and me were all sent off to see the original British 25 Minutes into the Future, because that was the only thing that existed, and then meet with Peter and Phil and Steve and talk through some ideas and pitch. And we all got assignments. And I can remember I wound up renting an office from Rockne O'Bannon. He had this little office that he'd been kind of in and out for a couple of years, just down Ventura Boulevard. It was like one room and a bathroom, $300 a month. And so I had this assignment. I didn't have room to work at home right then because I had a new baby and a small house. And so I'm sitting there in what was one of the rainier seasons in LA history. So I pitched this idea for security systems.
Okay.
And having the time of my life. I mean, I was writing this and it's one of the few times where I'm just looking at the experience and knowing it from the inside is like, this is what I was born to do. So I did connect with the material to that extent. I turned in the script, you know, by this time I'd probably written for 8 or 9 TV shows. So I've been through the experience of turning in scripts, and you never quite know how they're going to be received. And sometimes you feel you connected with the material. Sometimes it was just a job. I turned that in just in absolute confidence. I just said, this is going to rock their world because it is perfectly their show. And I was right. I mean, I think I was out running some errand the day before cell phones. I know it's probably hard to believe, but I stopped at the farmer's market because I turned in the script like on a Monday. This is a Tuesday. And I was just arrogant or confident enough to think they're going to love this. And the only way people would get in touch with you is, you know, they would call your home phone and leave a message. So I stopped to the farmer's market, dialed my home number, and heard a message from Peter Wag saying, "Love this script. Can you come in and meet with us tomorrow?" And I went in and they offered me a job.
Nice.
So that was how it happened.
And that particular episode too, security systems, that feels to me like, and I don't know if this was like the buzzword that was going around at the time when you were working on this, but that feels like the blueprint for the cyberpunk role-playing game, you know, because like so much of that game is about you putting together a team, finding a location you're going to break into, breaking in, getting the secret data transferred to your computer, and then getting
Yeah.
out. And I was like, that's security. That is your script.
What I just simply, pitched to them was the idea that Max has to deal with or confront, in essence, his female avatar in a hostile environment, and that kind of led me to the what is Edison doing, and there ultimately has to be a hacking and cracking thing.
Right.
And yes, I was certainly aware of that type of writing. I mean, William Gibson had published Neuromancer in 1984. And I certainly knew that. I knew Gibson and knew all that kind of writing and was a big fan of it. So it's probably less that it came from security systems, just that security systems was drawing from the same tropes, the same, in essence, film noir style stories.
Yeah.
And I was also, I mean, the other part of my writing is this sort of journalistic space history thing. I was very much aware of and fascinated by a company called TRW at that time, which is now part of Northrop Grumman, based in LA. They not only handled America's credit system, credit checks. And this is, it's at the beginning of the cybernetic revolution and computer online banking.
Right.
But they also built signals intelligence satellites, some of the most secret spy satellites ever. And it always struck me as horrifying that this is somewhere, one part of this company was going to talk to the other part of the company, and who knew what was going to result. And so I will admit now that security systems was actually TRW.
Working through some anxiety about that. Nice.
Yes. I have seen the episode recently. I think Steve may have told you guys, and I may have emailed you that we had a kind of a Max Headroom reunion. This is George had
at his
somehow
theater
finagled me into agreeing to come to his theater in Santa Fe and I literally spent 11 days living in one of his guest houses in the basement of it, going to his theater every night for like 8 days in a row while they ran 20 minutes into the future, and then every episode of the ABC Max, 2 episodes a night. And then we finished
14 episodes
with a staged live reading of Xmas, of George's unproduced Max script, with Matt Frewer there as Edison Carter and Max. I somehow finagled Steve and Max to come in for the last week. But was watching those shows, I was pleased with the way security systems held up, and several of the others. I was watching those shows, and some of which I have to tell you, I had never actually seen at least one of those episodes at all, because I don't think it was not aired by ABC at the time. It just sort of went into the vault, and it probably aired somewhere else, but I had never seen it.
Right.
And I was generally quite pleased with certainly the dialogue and the attitudes. I mean, some of the stories were a little slow in places and all that, but and I do have some problems. I did not like the voice they used for the security systems AI A7. Also thought that the script kind of got a little, like Act 4 is twice as long as it should be, things like that. But I wasn't in a position to fight at that time. I was the story editor on Max Headroom, but I do think I got it. Love it to this day. So. But yeah, went Twilight Zone to Max Headroom, then had that experience, which, in the rosy haze of memory, looks like it was all fun. But I can tell you by October 1987, when I'd been on the show since February, and also again, it was they didn't shut down Max bit by bit the way they did Twilight Zone. They came in and just executed Max Headroom as a TV series. I was there doing rewrites on a weekend, knowing that in the next 2 business days, they were going to pull the plug on us. And I was sitting there watching baseball playoffs out of the corner of my eye while I was doing what I knew was a pointless rewrite. And I actually had a headache the entire time. So it was just sort of, and accumulated stress, because it was a very expensive, very complex show to produce in those days. And that's in fact what did it. I mean, the show was out of control. Lorimar did not want to spend the money we were spending. Yeah, there was a lot of taking advantage of the accounting lag, I think. Somebody at Lorimar didn't realize till it was too late that, oh, we're over budget. And I'm still in touch with Peter Wag to some degree and have affection for him, but I don't think he cared particularly. I mean, and there's no reason why he would. I mean, I used to say of Peter and Steve with great affection that they not only didn't want to do American television, they'd never seen it. So it's like, we're doing what we need to do. And I was happy to do that. Steve used to call me the little Swiss clockmaker, because I was even then into working regular hours. And I was also, at least in some attempts, I did a draft of a script kind of in the middle of a sequence where I already knew we were in big budget trouble. And so I wrote one that could actually have been shot easily in 7 days. I mean, I consolidated locations. I did a lot of some of the tricks of the trade that would stand me well even now. And Peter sent it back saying, Michael, it's too small. Make it bigger. So I made it bigger and thus more expensive, much more expensive.
Rumor has it that season 2 was supposed to be 13 episodes, which would mean that there were 5 other episodes that just never got produced. And we were wondering if you could talk about any of the plans that existed for the rest of the series that never got made.
Well, I mean, when they pulled the plug on us, I think we had started production on episode 7 of that 13. And it was my script, and it was called Families. And it was about Edison having to deal with the visit by his mother and father. And then them having to deal with Max.
Oh my gosh.
Because they have a new kid, basically.
Is he a stepchild? What is he? So, and that was what I was rewriting on October 14th, watching the Twins and Tigers in some baseball game and resenting the whole situation by then, because we went out to shoot like one day of it. And then it just started like toward the end of day 2, that Tuesday, the word came out, we're done. And it was just, stop what you're doing, just stop. Whereas like with Twilight Zone, they had canceled us, but they had allowed us to continue to finish producing a couple of episodes that were already ready to go and prepped and sunk cost. A lot of money had been put into them already. No, but with Max, they just, pulled the plug right then. And we were actually shooting on a giant tower in downtown LA, the Independence Day Tower, or something like that. But I recall that we literally had a crew on the roof doing some helicopter Steadicam stuff, and they just stopped. And we had a huge party somewhere that night, somewhere downtown, as I recall. It was fuzzy the day after, and it's even fuzzier now. But one of the scripts was that. One of the scripts was George's Xmas, the holiday episode, where everybody shops. It's whoever spends the most money has got the most Xmas spirit. And I think there was one other one. But that was the other problem, is we were starting to it was going to be tight for us to finish those 13 scripts. I mean, there are a couple of people we had added to the staff, but it was still largely Steve and me doing, as often the case. I mean, these days, the showrunner is that person. But in that era, Peter was not a writer. And so it was Steve as the primary rewriter of everything, and me as the other writer, kind of doing, well, if it was baseball, I would be the middle reliever when your team's getting blown out, the guy you bring in the 3rd inning to try to get you to the 7th or 8th. And then Steve would come in and polish things up.
Get it all the way there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To the extent we are just, to quote another old science fiction writer who worked in television, the scripts were never actually finished. They were simply abandoned. Just
I feel like I've done that with a few short
we
stories
got what we
too.
got. But it's a key part of my evolution and transformation, because
For sure.
even as I look at my career, that's kind of the highlight of my career. It's the one thing that
Wow.
I look back on that even to this day, people know.
Well, a show which you already mentioned, Erie, Indiana, is another one of my faves. Did you get to work with Joe Dante on that?
Oh yes, yeah. Joe had done the pilot with Carl Schaefer
Yeah.
and Jose Rivera, and I was finishing up. I was actually stuck on WLU when
Oh.
Erie got going.
Okay.
We had we had premiered. Oh, it was another great show, fun to work on. We had premiered and then been on the air, and then the Gulf War broke out, and so
Right.
we were on for 6 weeks and then off for 6 weeks, and then came back late. And so the network hadn't made a decision on what to do, because we were still airing and we were all still under contract. So I knew of Erie. I had read Carl's and Jose's first couple of scripts, just thought it was fantastic. I mean, one was The Retainer. Um, the other one was Foreverwhere. And I thought they were great, but I was unable to do anything, and was just really. And then they canceled 90210, or I canceled WLU. And I was sitting around, as writers do at that point, going, "Well, I've just been screwed over." And also, we were in the process of rebuilding our house, so I was literally stuck here with no job and a house that was in the middle of a massive remodeling. So I was not in a good mood.
Oh.
Um, Suddenly, out of the blue, I mean, Erie was almost on the air. They hadn't aired yet. I get a call from Carl asking me what I'm doing, and it turned out that he had a writer producer named Gary Markowitz, who had been working on it for 4 or 5 months. But Markowitz had a pilot that he'd done the previous year for NBC, and NBC had suddenly, in their chaos, picked it out of the pile and said, "We're producing this," and they'd yanked him on the show because it was a prior commitment. And so
Whoa.
Carl suddenly had an opening. And oddly enough, I also had at the same time an offer from another show and another not a writer producer, but a line producer, friend of mine named Scott Brazil, who I'd worked with on WLU and TV 101.
Mm.
He wanted me to go to work on a thing called Jack's Place. And funny, it was an hour-long show for ABC,
Okay.
kind of about a nightclub. And then there was Erie, but I had seen Erie, seen the scripts, and I just knew this is me.
Right.
So I turned down this much more lucrative 1 hour thing, higher title, just to go to work on Erie. In that sense, great, because Jack's Place came on and was gone in 6 episodes. Erie, we did 18, I think.
Mm-hmm.
We were renewed. And yes, Joe Dante was there. I worked with Joe Dante. I worked with Ken Kwapis, who became a good friend, a great director. We had a ton of fun doing Tornado Days.
Mm-hmm.
Worked with Bob Balaban,
Right.
who's directed one of the episodes. It was, and working with Jose and Matt Dearborn, an old friend of mine, one of the funnier people I've ever met in my life. And yeah, it just almost every episode was just great. There were a couple of episodes we left in the locker room there that would have been we had some concept about a haunted gingerbread man that we spent 2 days on. I'd never have laughed so hard in my life as developing that episode, and we could just never get anybody to go for it. But yes, it was I'm a small town guy, and so in West, so writing about tornadoes and the local lodge, all that kind of stuff was just right up my alley. That was as much fun as writing Max. And I knew the day that ended that it was just kind of, I would be damn lucky to ever have something that fun again.
There is such a tone to that show that I don't know if it's really ever been captured again, because it's like, it's not exactly only for kids, but it's not exactly only for adults either. And like, it treats kids very like straightforward, like it's not kind of condescending, but it's also kind of like, I've never seen anything else that quite walks this line before, and I think that might be why it sticks out.
The way it got conceived was that Carl Schaefer had wanted to do something about basically young Tom Sawyer kind of show.
Right.
So, this smart ass kid in a ridiculous town. And Jose Rivera had wanted to do something about a like a Twilight Zone aimed at a younger audience, and someone had put the two of them together, and they had merged it and blended it and became out. So I suppose it is literally it. It's Tom Sawyer in the Twilight Zone is kind of what it was. And Tom Sawyer was always a fairly knowledgeable young young man, and some version of Hannibal, Missouri in the 1840s. So getting a director like Joe Dante, who was so good at that kind of stuff, just kind of set the tone. It's like, yes, there were going to be ridiculous, over the top things, but you're going to treat them like they're not just serious, but that you're going to have an attitude about them.
Mm-hmm.
Simon was the most fun to write for me because he was just, kind of clueless, but the truth speaker.
Right.
Marshall would be saying, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this. And, Simon would be, yes, but what about, isn't that Amelia Earhart? It's like, no, that's ridiculous.
Right.
Or is it? I mean, so it was just, it was fun. I realized it was all 30 years ago.
What's interesting
the
is
show was being developed.
What's interesting is that so much of Joe Dante's work and Max Headroom overwhelmed me as a child in terms of my imagination, and I realized that you were kind of like the connecting thread between his worlds and Max Headroom.
Well, yeah, I am the person who went from one to the other, and I would say that what made me suited for Max is what made me suited for Erie. I mean, they were absolutely my sense of storytelling and especially dialogue and character, just how they would react to things, and what fun they would try to have in what could be dire circumstances. Yeah, I suppose in essence, I'm the the common voice there.
So my favorite credit that I found when I was searching around online about you is you are listed as space historian in the documentary series The Universe, and this leads to your nonfiction writing
Yes.
career. And some part of me when I was growing up found both science fiction and NASA equally interesting, and so I was wondering, was this similar to your parallel interests in science fiction and space?
Absolutely. To me, spaceflight and science fiction were the same thing. Especially when I was about 11 years old, I was reading Red Planet by Robert A. Heinlein and watching the first Gemini missions. And it was just, they've always marched, in tandem. My view of science fiction has obviously expanded and gone beyond. It's not just rockets and spaceships and other planets. But the interest in the nonfiction world has persisted. I mean, I must know 100 astronauts.
Very
and
cool.
I've written autobiographies of two of them, and then a biography of a guy who, well, the book is The Astronaut Maker. Is a guy who,
George Abbey
ran George Abbey.
Yeah.
And so I'm still in touch with that world very much. That I have another project that's kind of cooking that is space related as well. So I haven't given that up at all. And in terms of the actual objective success of what I've done, those space books are the Deke Slayton book is the most successful thing I've ever done. It's still in print 25 years later.
Yeah.
And I still get emails about it.
Yeah. I was gonna,
and it's just fun getting to know those people, and part of it's just curiosity or nosiness is you just look at it and say, what's really going on here? And that was what drove me to get to work with those particular people.
I was going to ask, but it seems like you've answered it, that you actually know a fair number of astronauts, because the story of George Abbey seems a little obscure. I even kind of had to look it up. And so I just I wanted to make sure, how did you get onto this?
Actually, the title I wanted to use for the book was Unidentified NASA Official.
That's great.
be what he was in the press. He was not someone who was ever forward or out there. He was the obscure bureaucrat who, as is often the case with obscure bureaucrats or the deep state for you QAnon folks out there, who really run things.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a guy who had this career. He had been an Air Force pilot, had wanted to be a space traveler himself, had experience as an engineer working on one of the first American human spaceflight programs, the Dinosaur space plane, which was in existence the same time as it's literally started the same few months as the Mercury program. Just it never went anywhere. And George wound up, not by his choice necessarily, but being dragged into Apollo as an engineer. And then he just rose through that system where he was everywhere. He was with the Apollo 1 astronauts the night before they died in the fire. He was here, he was there, doing and involved in all these things. And then in the mid 90s, suddenly he was in charge of, he was the gatekeeper to space. Who got to fly in the space shuttle? Who got selected as an astronaut? He was the one making all those decisions certainly for about 15 years, just directly. And then indirectly, he later on was running the Johnson Space Center after having been at NASA headquarters as the deputy to the administrator. He had a 37-year career right at the cutting edge of NASA spaceflight. And to me, he was just somebody who absolutely had a story to be told, even though nobody knew who he was.
Yeah, I mean, it's an astonishing book, and it's only a couple years old too. So I mean, I think that
it only came out in 2018.
Yeah, I think for people who are mostly remember you from 80s television, you have all these novels, you have all this nonfiction work under your belt. There's a whole other side to Michael Cassutt that maybe people aren't even familiar with that is equally fascinating.
Well, thank you. And that's, I mean, I've confessed for years that, if I'd concentrated on one thing, it would have been better for my overall standing. But I've always, as I think I said earlier, it's always been three fronts for me. It's always been fiction. In fact, I spent the plague year last year writing a new novel.
Ooh.
Which I'm now kind of polishing and editing and hope to submit here soon.
We should have you back when the book's
published. Very
published.
exciting.
Yeah.
Then the television, primarily fiction. Yeah, and then the nonfiction, most of it dealing with spaceflight. But I have another nonfiction book I want to do as well that has nothing to do with anything like that. So, it's career ADHD, I guess, or just, follow your interests.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been truly wonderful, just an absolute delight. And thanks for letting us keep you a little bit long. And do have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, as aspiring writers here.
Oh well, sorry for the.
Oh, you're fine.
Oh, not at all.
Yeah, it's always good to hear little tips.
Well, as aspiring writers, I hope. Yeah, I'm sorry. Do you want me to give you some, or
you gave us so much already?
Plenty already. Yeah. I mean, hearing the process is actually always fascinating for me. So I'm always curious about. I mean, even looking at people's desks is always, fascinating.
I can show you this one picture back there.
Yeah.
That picture.
Mm-hmm.
That's me from Max.
Oh, wow.
Oh, nice.
taken by Steve, and what he's got written on it is basically it's dedicated to the Swiss clockmaker.
All right.
Wow.
Oh, that's fantastic.